came when there was kind of an effort inside the UN to silence me, that I shouldn't be speaking out so much. And I came to learn that was because of external pressure that was coming from some Israel lobby groups. And there was a kind of a reticence in the international community where you see real genocide happening. It was unusual in a number of ways. One is that many of the specific actions that are listed in the Genocide Convention had been carried out in Gaza and elsewhere in Palestine. Of course, mass killings, that's obvious. Causing serious harm, including bodily harm to these people, that's obvious. There's a line about imposing conditions of life that are designed to bring about the destruction of the group in whole or in part. Well, that's obvious because we've had, for many, many years now, a closure and a siege on Gaza, which is specifically designed to prevent Gazans from having adequate food, medicine, water, sanitation, healthcare, freedom of movement, all of the things that are necessary for a decent life. And so we've got an exceptionally strong case of that element as well. But even more important than that, the part of genocide that is usually the most difficult to prove, that we've actually got senior Israeli leaders publicly and on the record expressing their genocidal intent. And so we've had statements of genocidal intent from the president, the prime minister, ministers in the government, senior military officials, think tanks associated with the Israeli government. This is very, very unusual to have such clear statements of intent. So we have had since 1948 a series of ethnic purges of Palestinians from Israel and the occupied territories. This would not be the first time that the West was implicated in settler colonialism. I mean, it is something that grew very much out of the West, not just in Palestine, but elsewhere in the Americas and beyond. So that's not a very unusual thing. I do think the West is implicated. We have seen active complicity because while these assaults are happening, take the United States, for example, we've seen the US financing, arming, providing intelligence support, providing diplomatic cover, and even providing a veto in the Security Council to facilitate the Israeli actions in Gaza. This is complicity in legal terms, for which the United States is also accountable. So absolutely the West is involved. We've seen this with the US, with the UK, with a number of European governments, quite shockingly, who not only have been supporting what it is that Israel's been doing, but they have been repressing dissent inside their own countries by prohibiting protests. I think these so-called humanitarian pauses, which are 4-hour pauses, right? 4 hours, which is a meaningless amount of time, really, when you look at the situation of these people in the densely populated, thoroughly destroyed Gaza Strip, many of whom are injured, where there's no reasonable infrastructure, where there are disabled people, where there are people in hospitals, where there are pregnant women, there's senior people, and so on. The idea that those 4 hours would be meaningful it seems to me, is absurd. There's nothing humanitarian about a 4-hour pause in between massacres. Okay, we'll give you a head start. Take 4 hours before we come back and start killing again. That's not something that is to be praised as a humanitarian act. That's a crime for which there has to be accountability. I think it's the same Nakba. What we have seen, as I said, in the context, starting in 1948, with successive ethnic purges, is an indication of a continuation of the Nakba, a continuation of ethnic cleansing, and as I've said, a part of the context of the genocide that is unfolding there. The intention is to take over all of historic Palestine. Look at a map of the West Bank, you will see why ideas like a two-state solution are such an absurdity. I think the intention is very clear. It is to continue this ethno-nationalist settler colonial project and to replace the indigenous Palestinian population with settlers, Israeli settlers, all the way across Gaza, across the West Bank, across Jerusalem. I'm talking about the political side of the House. They've allowed themselves to be intimidated by strong démarches from Western states, like the US and the UK and some Europeans. They've allowed themselves to be intimidated by badgering from Israel lobby groups that have dedicated themselves not just to impunity on the part of the Israeli government, but to the smearing of United Nations human rights defenders and others. We're only silenced if we're allowed to be silenced. The reaction to that was an attempt to silence me, which I thought was not something that I could accept, which is why I announced that I would be leaving. That's certainly true, especially for the Germans, who bear responsibility for the horrific genocide of the Holocaust. And that certainly is reflected. They haven't learned the fundamental lessons that never again means never again for anybody. Ultimately, settler colonialism always leads to genocide. The West has a hard time in dealing with the reality of this particular question. It's time for us to learn the lessons of the struggle against apartheid and apply that same anti-apartheid struggle in Israel and Palestine in solidarity with Christian, Muslim, Jewish people all around the world who are demanding what we demand in every other situation, which is equality. Trepidation that exists in the UN, I can tell you from the inside, that is because of the external pressure that comes from powerful Western states, from lobby groups, and so on. It's the same thing with the prosecutor and the court. Here, that political pressure, especially from the West, has resulted in a double standard being manifest by the prosecutor's office at the International Criminal Court. Compare the rapidity with which they responded to appeals for action on Ukraine, and you put that up against the foot dragging of the prosecutor in the court over many years now to deal with war crimes and crimes against humanity in Palestine, you'll see where the problem is. But the International Criminal Court has a long way before it's going to prove to the world that it's just not a mechanism set up to try people in Africa. Palestine will be free!